It's Thursday, January 26, 2023. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies at the University of Georgia. Joining me here today on campus is Mr. John Pruitt. A native of Seneca, South Carolina, John grew up in Decatur, Georgia, and earned a bachelor's degree in history from Davidson College. He began his career in television news as a cameraman reporter with WSB-TV in 1964. After a 2-year stint in the U.S. Army, John returned to WSB, where he became weekend anchor and by 1973 weeknight news anchor. From 1978 until 1993, he was WXIA TV's evening news anchor. He returned to WSB in 1994 as evening news anchor, a position he held until his retirement in 2010. He is a multiple Emmy Award winner and a member of both the Atlanta Press Club Hall of Fame and the Georgia Broadcasters Hall of Fame. Most recently, John is the author of Tell It True, a novel, which was published late last year by Mercer University Press. John, thank you so much for making the trip over here to Athens.
Always a pleasure. Good to be with you.
It's an honor to host you here at the University of Georgia.
Thank you.
So let's start at the beginning. Tell me about your childhood and upbringing.
Well, I was born in Seneca, South Carolina, and unfortunately, I can't claim to be a native Georgian. A lot of people think I am a native Georgian. But my mom and dad took me to Seneca because she had relatives there, and so that was the place of my birth. We didn't live in Seneca. I was born there, and then quickly my family moved to Georgia, Atlanta. So my earliest memories are of Atlanta, growing up in an apartment on Ponce de Leon, the Ivanhoe Apartments.
You pronounce it correct. You pronounce it like a native.
Third floor unit, just down from the old Majestic Grill, west of Briarcliff Road. That's where I spent my early years. We moved to North Augusta, South Carolina for 2 years when I was in the 5th grade, and then back to Atlanta, where I've lived ever since.
Well, what did your parents do? What your mom and dad do?
My mother was a first grade teacher, quite accomplished. She had a wonderful career, and then the boys came along. I had 2 brothers. She raised us and then went back into teaching and had a long and distinguished career in DeKalb County schools as a first grade teacher. And you would be amazed at the number of people who've contacted me to tell me either she taught them or had taught their kids. So she was a treasure. She lived to be almost 104 years old.
Wow.
And she was a joy and a wonder. My dad was a salesman, a traveling salesman for a pharmaceutical company, Mead Johnson. So we moved around a little when I was young, but once we reached Atlanta, aside from that foray to North Augusta, South Carolina for 2 years, we stayed in Georgia.
So were you raised in a family that were daily consumers of the news of the day and discussed it at the dinner table? Was that
I'm not aware that that was the case at all. I grew up without a great deal of interest or knowledge of current affairs. Of course, you have to remember, I was born in 1942, so television was not something you normally turned to in the late evening. I think we had our first TV set maybe in the late 40s, early 50s. And of course, in those days, television news was not that big a deal. Mm-hmm. So to answer your question, I have no memory of any agitated discussions around the family dinner table about FDR or Truman or anything else.
So tell me, what was it that, what was Decatur like growing up? Was it, a lot of folks have great memories of their childhood and their neighborhoods, and others less so.
Yes, we actually lived initially in South DeKalb County in a very small house, 2-bedroom home. I shared a bedroom with my 2 brothers, and we lived there for a while. I went to Southwest DeKalb High School, and then in the 9th grade we moved to Druid Hills. So I really grew up in the Druid Hills area, but I ran with, a gang from Decatur. Shouldn't use the term gang, but some friends from Decatur. Gangs were not a thing back then. I was in a Boy Scout troop in Decatur, and we went to Decatur Presbyterian Church, where my children were baptized as well. And Decatur was just a lovely residential community. close enough to Atlanta to have a certain urban vibe to it, but far enough away in those days to have its own identity, and it was a wonderful place to grow up.
Now, I read somewhere that you were in the same Boy Scout troop as Pierre Howard.
Pierre Howard and I got Eagle Scout on the same night at the old DeKalb County Courthouse. It was the largest group of Eagles ever to receive the award on the same evening in DeKalb County. Congressman James C. Davis was there to
Judge Davis,
hand out the awards, and of course my mom was there to pin the Eagle badge on my uniform. But yes, Pierre and I were contemporaries in terms of getting the Eagle on the same night. We were in different troops.
Okay.
As I recall, Pierre was in Troop 6, and I was in Troop 163, and we were bitter rivals.
I'm sure. I'm sure. So you were in Druid Hills, Decatur, but you decided to pursue your higher education at Davidson College up in North Carolina. Why not stick close to home and go to Emory?
Well, I applied to Emory, and I'm happy to say I was accepted at Emory. I also applied at Presbyterian College and Davidson College. I'm a Presbyterian.
Okay.
And Davidson had a very good reputation, not only among Presbyterians, but in the South.
Sure.
As a great regional liberal arts college. And once I got the acceptance to Davidson, there was not a real question as to where I would go. Emory was too close to home, and PC was sort of a backup school. I say that telling you my daughters both went to Presbyterian College and had a wonderful experience and met their husbands at Presbyterian College.
Presbyterian College Blue Hose.
Blue Hose, but I chose to be a wildcat.
That's right.
And went to Davidson and had a marvelous experience at Davidson College.
And you decided to study history.
Yeah, I should have probably stuck with English. I had better grades in English.
That was my second question. I was like, why not English or journalism?
Did a lot of writing. Did some writing for the school paper and did some creative writing. Had a couple of stories published. I won the Vereen Bell Award, which is the top writing prize Davidson gives, and had some short stories I wrote published in college publications. But history was really my love as well, and Davidson had a terrific history department. And I got very stimulated by it and got into it deeply. And I didn't make the grades in history I made in English. It was tougher, but as I look back, I'm very happy that I have that history major.
What topics or fields or time periods drew your attention most?
History courses, the ones I remember most were British constitutional history, where I learned an enormous amount. American diplomatic history, and the professors made it for us. Brad Thompson was my British history professor, I should say. Very tough, very tough. Malcolm Lester was my American diplomatic history professor. And there were others who really made it come alive and really gave me an interest in history that has remained undiminished to this day. I still consume history. My reading of choice is historical literature, biography, even historical fiction. So that's what I like to read. And there's one great thing about a liberal arts education, as you know. It simply starts you off on a process of lifelong learning. And that's why I hope all of my grandchildren will go to a liberal arts college and master that same technique.
Right. I mean, I'm a graduate of Westminster College, which is was an affiliate of the Presbyterian Church USA, just like you.
Right.
So yeah, I can attest that these days some folks question the value, especially with the rising cost of college of a liberal arts degree. But I think you've really hit. Not that we're getting paid by these schools to say this, but I think.
Well, I think your point is a good one, and I understand because the cost of a college education today is astronomical. So I think it's appropriate to question whether you're getting value received for the amount of money you're putting into it. So that's another topic. But the value of liberal arts education to me is unquestioned because it opens so many doors and possibilities as to what you will end up doing. I graduated from Davidson having no clue what I would do. I had done some writing. I thought, well, let me find something that will allow me to write. And I ended up going to newspapers to try to find a job, none of which would hire me. But that led me into television, which was quite fortunate. And I found the history degree, the liberal arts education, has just been invaluable to me as a journalist.
Well, tell me about that job hunting process. And I'm sure this is a story you've told countless times before about your rejection from print journalism and landing in as you alluded to earlier, sort of not the backwater, but definitely second fiddle to print journalism, which is television news, broadcast news.
Well, you have to remember, this was 1964. Television news was not really a thing in 1964. I mean, there were television newscasts, and they did a fine job. But for a career, most journalism students didn't think of television news as a primary career choice. That came a little later. Newspapers were still the coin of the realm in terms of journalism.
Right.
But in interviewing at the AJC, where I got turned down, and I certainly don't blame them. I mean, I had no journalistic experience at all. But one of the editors I talked to took an interest in me. And I think because my mom had taught his kid in school, something like that. Anyway, he called Ray Moore, who was news director at WSB-TV. Ray Moore, one of the most distinguished journalists I've ever known, was there. But I didn't really know much about Ray Moore. I knew he did the news, and so I was a little nervous and went over and interviewed with Ray in his office. And it was a very offbeat employment interview. One of the questions Ray asked was, "Have you read War and Peace?"
Did he ask everybody that question?
I don't know. I don't know, but maybe knowing I'd been to Davidson College, he expected me to say yes, and I'm happy to say I could say yes. And he had read it too, and he said, "I didn't like it very much." And I said, "Well, I frankly did like it a great deal." I think he hired me based on that, because there was no other reason to hire me except for the fact that I was willing to work for $1.25 an hour, which is what they were paying me. That's $55 a week before taxes. He wasn't taking a huge risk because he wasn't paying me much. And I was basically hired, Ashton, to be an errand boy in the newsroom, do whatever job needed to be done, whether it be posting the baseball scores on little menu boards that they could photograph, or sweeping up the editing room. I mean, I would do anything. I was happy to be there. Not really knowing that this would be a wonderful career that would last me half a century. The beginnings were not auspicious, shall we say.
Well, at the risk of insulting you, it sounds like I inflated your job title during your introduction.
Well, initially true, but you know, it was humble beginnings.
So what was, for lack of a better, your big break? What was the first time you felt like you were in the thick of it?
Almost from the very beginning. My first week on the job at WSB was the first week of July 1964. On the 2nd of July 1964, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of '64 into law. I had been there 4 days, and they said, "We've got a segregationist rally protesting the Civil Rights Act at the Lakewood Stadium in South Atlanta, a high school football stadium." They would not assign me to that. I had never covered a story. I didn't know how to shoot news film. But they did assign Dave Riggs, one of our senior reporters, who later went on to become news director and producer for NBC, assigned me to help him carry equipment, which is, and there was a lot of equipment for a TV news story back in the day. So I helped Dave carry the equipment out to the field, and the football field. And we were filming the speakers who were speaking from a flatbed truck. Ross Barnett was one of them. I think Lester Maddox was one of them. And into this rally of segregationists that had been roiled to fever pitch by the oratory came 4 black students protesting the fact that this rally was going on.
So sort of counter-protesters.
Counter-protesting. Only 4 of them. Thousands of whites. And the crowd went absolutely berserk. And they began beating these kids with fists and even folded metal folding chairs. And Dave Riggs, gave me a Bell & Howell silent camera and a 15-second tutorial on how to use it, and more or less pushed me toward the action. he couldn't leave. He was on a tripoded camera, so he pushed me toward the action, see what you can get. So I'm relatively close to it. There was this chain link fence separating me from the violence, but I could see the violence and I could film the violence, and miraculously, the film turned out. At least some of it turned out. And the film that both Dave and I shot that evening went coast to coast on the NBC Nightly News.
That's right, because WSB was the NBC.
NBC back in those days. In effect, the NBC bureau in the South, NBC had no presence in the South except for WSB as the bureau. They depended on us for this coverage. And they eagerly took that footage and put it on their network newscast. And as horrified as I had been by what I had seen, I certainly had seen nothing like this in my life, I was also exhilarated by the fact that I realized that what I saw, everybody in the country who had a TV set at 6:30 in the evening also saw it, which sort of presaged the idea that television news, by transmitting these images nationwide, night after night after night, really advanced the cause of civil rights, because people were shocked, they were stunned, they watched it unbelieving at what was going on in the South, and things began to happen. It was a time of great turmoil, great violence. The fact that I had only been there a week didn't seem to matter after that, because we had a small news department, not that many people, and they needed guys who could shoot film. And I say guys because at that point, women had not become a factor in TV newsrooms to speak of. And so I quickly learned how to shoot film. And within a month, I was going out and covering stories.
You already had that frontline experience. You were a
veteran. I did. I was battle hardened after my first assignment.
You mentioned Lester Maddox. I think I read somewhere that you covered the protest at the Pickrick.
Yeah. In fact, one of my treasured photographs from my archives is a UPI wire service photo of Lester Maddox outside the Pickrick. He is pushing a black protester away from the restaurant. And this was '64, right after the Civil Rights Act was passed. And there's a kid with a silent camera between them in the picture, and it's me. So I treasure it. You wouldn't recognize me. I looked very young. In fact, I was young. But yeah, I did cover Lester. He was an incredibly interesting man. And the Pickrick was an extraordinary experience. I mean, it was day after day after day of being out there watching Lester, ride his bicycle backwards and threaten to beat people with pick handles. Everybody says axe handles. He was very specific. No, they're pick handles. The Pickrick was his restaurant, a fried chicken emporium on Hemp Hill Avenue. So we had some interesting times.
He didn't want to get the branding wrong.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So it sounds like it was this witch's brew of a carnival with, as you say, really nasty racial antagonism all rolled into one.
Yes, Lester was always fairly clear in that he wasn't attacking black people directly. It was the federal intrusion into his right as a private businessman to exclude whomever he pleased from his restaurant. But, you have to really split hairs to say that was anything other than racist action. And he became a cause célèbre. He was, a very identifiable figure. And he was a showman. He was a showman. He loved the cameras. As I said, he rode his bicycle backwards, and everybody loved that. He would talk a mile a minute. It was hard to shut him up. But he was a great interview if you could edit it down to a usable sequence. And of course, little did we know that he would become governor of Georgia in 1967.
Right. Well, but before then, you were, just as you're getting your feet under you at WSB, you're plucked out to the U.S. Were you drafted? Did you have a stint that you owed at some point?
I was ROTC at Davidson. In those days, you could either enlist, you could be drafted, or you could choose to go a different road as an officer. And going to Davidson College, it's a land-grant college, and ROTC was a required course the first 2 years. So once I had finished those 2 years, I opted to go ahead and continue and get my commission as a second lieutenant. So I had my date with the Army, and it was tough to leave the job that I was doing because so much was happening, and I felt like I'd really made strides. I was, feeling my own rhythm, and I had so much to learn still. And then to be suddenly, moving out to Fort Benning for 2 months, and then to Korea for 13 months.
Halfway around the world.
So I was gone for 2 years, but I'm happy to say at the end of my tour, I came right back to SB, and they welcomed me with open arms.
Were you concerned that your career at WSB had been short-circuited and that once you got out, who knew where you would land?
There were unknowns, and it was concerning.
Right.
But of course, when you're in the Army, you're focused on, finishing your tour, and I was on the other side of the world in South Korea. But I was actually working in media in South Korea. I was in the Armed Forces Radio TV network in Seoul. I was quite lucky in that respect, not to be up on the DMZ where I thought I was going. So it wasn't as tough a tour as it was for a lot of guys who were up on the DMZ or out in the boondocks.
Sure. By the time you arrived, was Ray Morris still director, or had Hal Suit come in?
When I came back, Ray was still news director. And it was shortly after that, maybe a couple of years, that he resigned. Maybe even not a couple of years, maybe the next year. I don't recall the date.
Sure.
Late 60s. Ray resigned. It was a shock for all of us.
Right.
He was an unparalleled leader and a journalist who was respected nationwide. A brilliant man. And he left because he got into a dispute with the AJC TV critic, Paul Jones, I believe, if memory serves.
That's right.
And the station refused to let Ray respond to the criticism on air. At least that's what Ray told us. That's why he resigned. And Hal Suit became news director, and luckily we had Hal there, fully capable and qualified, and also a highly respected figure and a loved figure to step into Ray's shoes.
Now, what were your memories of Hal Suit? Because, of course, very soon you'd be covering him in the news. So, correct me if I'm wrong. He came from Ohio originally?
Yes,
okay.
yes. Hal was a wonderful man. I was a pallbearer in Hal's funeral. He, at the age of 20, 21, 22, had his leg blown off in France by a German tank. Unlike a lot of World War II veterans who will not talk about their experience, Hal loved to talk about the experience. I mean, it was extraordinary. He had no problem with it. He had an artificial leg and limped around, but just a terrific guy, really good journalist. And he was great to work for because he was a newsman through and through, and he was a tough newsman. I mean, he would brook no nonsense. And then, yes, he did announce for governor. Actually, he didn't announce for governor. It was interesting. We talked about Ray, and Ray actually went to work for our competitor, WAGA,
Right.
Channel 5.
Channel 5.
And on their first hour-long newscast, Channel 2 had been doing an hour, 6 o'clock show for a couple of years, I believe in 70. Ray's lead story is Hal Suit is running for governor. Well, on WSB, there's Hal Suit anchoring the 6 o'clock news. So his co-anchor, Dick Horner, it was an amazing thing to see. We find out that our competitor has broken the story about our anchorman, our news director, running for governor. And so Dick Horner, who is a terrific newsman, great anchor, becomes not just a co-anchor, he becomes the inquisitor. He pins Hal against the wall. He starts interrogating Hal, his co-anchor on the air. It was a marvelous thing to watch. And that was Hal's last night on the anchor desk. Of course,
Sure.
He had to step aside and, in fact, announce that he was running for governor.
So, what was that like? Who stepped in to fill news director role when you learned about it one day?
Yeah, well,
here
Dave,
today, gone tomorrow.
I mentioned Dave Riggs earlier. And Dave became news director.
Okay.
And he was a fantastic news director.
So, what was it like going from reporting? You would be at a lot of out on the road, on location, to transitioning to the anchor desk. Was that your decision, or were you voluntold for that position?
Well, every reporter in television news wanted to be an anchor person. And my course to the 6 and 11 o'clock weekday anchor gig was long and circuitous. My initial assignment was the early morning Today Show cut-ins, 3.5-minute newscasts, 7:25, 8:25. And I could do those, and then for the rest of the day I would report. I would go out and report. It was often a very long day. So I'd come into work at 6 o'clock, 5:30, and then work until 7 o'clock. It was a long day. I did that for a number of years and then got the weekend news. I did the weekend news for almost 5 years. But doing the weekends, I was still reporting 3 days a week.
Okay.
So I kept the reporting thing in. And just this aside, I mean, reporting has always been the most fun, being in a TV newsroom. I mean, anchoring is great. There are a lot of benefits to it, a lot of advantages, but reporting is really what it's all about for me. And I look for every opportunity, even when I was doing the 6 and 11 weekday news, to get off the set and be out in the field and report. But it was not until 1973 that I became the weekday 6 and 11 o'clock anchor.
Now, were you always attracted to, for lack of a better word, political reporting, political news, or was that just something that you sort of, like this job itself, fell into your lap?
I think I was always attracted to it, mainly because it was so darn interesting. And the characters were so interesting. I was lucky to have been assigned to cover the Georgia legislature for a couple of years. And I spent a great deal of time with these wonderful, colorful characters, the likes of which we have not seen in a long time.
Those days are long gone.
James Sloppy Floyd, the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, for which a building is now named.
That's right.
The James Sloppy Floyd Memorial Office Building. But and he was a wonderful character. And in those days, they would come up to you and they'd share stories, and they would be very honest. There was none of this hostility toward media that I can recall. Publicly, there might be those lying Atlanta newspapers, that sort of thing.
You worked for Cox Media.
But they understood the media, and they liked us as individuals, and I liked them. And they were so colorful. Bobby Pafford, one of the great orators in the well of the House. These were the years when George L. Smith was Speaker of the House, and George T. Smith, as Lieutenant Governor, was the head officer in the Senate. Culver Kid. I mean,
Silver Fox.
I could keep naming them, and you would, of course, recognize them. But it was
Speaker Murphy.
Speaker Tom, and before that, the floor leader for Lester Maddox in the House. These were colorful people. They were interesting people. And as a journalist, you were drawn to cover interesting people. Mm-hmm. And you realize that these interesting people can do very consequential things. So I think it was probably an evolution that drew me into politics. The whole idea of running for public office, the power that they wield, the sometimes devious means with which they get elected, the colorful campaigns that we saw, and the huge issues that were very much in play in those days drew me into it. And those early years were the most fun. Later it became a little more staid, shall we say, or not quite as dramatic. Mm-hmm. Those early years of, Carl Sanders, and then Lester Maddox and Jimmy Carter, and then we had a more workmanlike succession: George Busby,
not a show horse.
Joe Frank Harris, Zell Miller. But they're all colorful and interesting people, and I did love covering them.
Well, I think a good transition here is you're talking about transition from exciting to staid would be the 1972 Democratic National Convention that you covered.
Yes.
Probably one of the last unscripted Although you could
They
make,
needed a script for that.
you could make an argument for 1976 Republican convention in Kemper Arena,
Or 68 in Chicago.
Were you at the 68?
I was not.
Well,
I was not.
So, but tell me about covering these conventions, and we see the conventions now, and of course 2020, that's an outlier for obvious reasons, with how produced it was because of the pandemic. But I want to get your thoughts on the evolution of those conventions as events, this sort of living, breathing events, to completely scripted and staged from gavel to gavel.
Well, I guess the 68 Chicago Convention was one that got completely out of control. At the height of the Vietnam War, the massive demonstrations that took place, the police riot and trying to control those demonstrations, Mayor Daley, all of that, even Lester Maddox was there trying to run for president. Crazy, crazy time. Very entertaining to watch, but it certainly called for some kind of control. And that convention, of course, led to 72, because there was a lot of reform to try to clean up the process.
The McGovern Commission.
The McGovern Commission, and it ended up with McGovern seizing a lot of delegates going into the 72 convention. It wasn't a sure thing, as I recall. There were other candidates still hopeful. That was a fascinating entree to conventions. 72, Vietnam War still a major factor. Protest in the streets, Flamingo Park. I recall the tear gas, weeping involuntarily as I walked around the sidewalks from all the tear gas that still hung in the air. The fact that almost every session ran well past midnight.
Right.
McGovern's acceptance speech came, 3 o'clock in the morning. Can
you imagine that
It
today?
was crazy, no. So no one heard his acceptance speech. And it was a mess. I mean, his choice of Eagleton as vice president, who had to resign because of brain shock therapy was revealed. And of course, in those days, it was a shocking thing, pardon the pun. And so Sergeant Shriver became the stand-in. So it was a debacle. And the entire McGovern campaign was a debacle. All of this pointed to the need for more control, more scripting. I'm sure the consultants got involved. And, well, actually, the Nixon convention in 72 in Miami Beach, they were both in Miami Beach, went very smoothly.
Sure.
So we've seen that more and more, shorter speeches, more razzmatazz, very little spontaneity. I miss some of that.
Well, what was it like in 1976 covering Jimmy Carter and his unlikely rise to presidential candidate and then the White House?
You'll be shocked to hear I did not cover either convention in '76. It's still a sore point. We won't go there. But I did cover the Carter campaign extensively from New Hampshire. Of course, Iowa was his big entree because no one really knew about the caucus system in Iowa.
He made the Iowa caucuses.
He made it happen.
Yeah.
And Jimmy Carter, with a small group of people, is one of the most effective politicians I've ever seen. He is galvanizing. And the circumstances were right for a man like Carter. We're coming out of Watergate. There's heavy cynicism toward politicians, Washington politicians in particular. So what better time for a New South governor with a theme of the American people deserve a government as good as they are, as his mantra, with a dedicated peanut brigade of volunteers going around and spreading Southern hospitality wherever they went. The stage was set for a man like that. His timing could not have been better. Not to mention the fact that he had a couple of geniuses working with him, Hamilton Jordan and others, Jody Powell.
Right.
He won Iowa. He came out of Iowa on a tear. My first coverage of him on the campaign was in New Hampshire. And back in those days, it was still a relatively small, quiet assemblage of reporters covering it. And I was privileged to be among some national luminaries covering Carter. And I'll never forget the plane ride we had from Manchester to Berlin up in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. There was a blizzard.
Oh, my God.
And if you know Jimmy Carter, you know that he is not deterred easily. He was going to make that flight, even though they warned him that, you might not want to go. And on that flight, I was on the flight with my crew. Sam Donaldson was on the flight. I believe Ed Rabel of CBS. A number of luminaries in the national media were there. And they were all trying to get to know this, young governor, former peanut farmer from Plains. What makes him tick? Who is he? So they were all clamoring to get to know him. And of course, I felt like I, knew him pretty well already.
Right.
So I had the advantage of listening to the interviews, and it was quite informative. We did land in Berlin. It was in the middle of a snowstorm. Horrifying, not horrifying, but I mean a scary flight. But he had a very successful campaign.
Right.
We shot some wonderful footage and did a documentary on that. Then I went to Florida, went to Philadelphia. I mean, it was a fascinating campaign.
Right.
Made all the more so by the controversies that occurred along the way. He made a remark about ethnic purity in referring to housing and integrated housing, and it took Daddy King and Andy Young to save him on that one. And there were some others, but he prevailed and barely beat Jerry Ford. It was very close.
Right. The infamous Playboy interview.
But to have a president from the Deep South was
yeah.
extraordinary.
And of course, during that 4-year term, you jumped ship to the rival WXIA.
Yes, I did.
To back to your own career. What led to that career move for you? That transition.
Well, we got a new news director who I don't think he was fully appreciative of my various talents and abilities, which was hard to understand because the ratings were very good.
WSB was always solidly
preeminent. And so he actually took me off the 11 o'clock news and put me on the noon news. I was doing the noon and the 6.
And that's backwards. Usually you work your way into prime time, not back.
The next rating period, the 11 o'clock news, which had been a consistent number 1, fell to number 2. And the noon news numbers went through the roof, and I felt, vindication. And I think there was some stirring in the station, what are we doing here? And it was in that context that WXIA, Dick Williams, good friend and respected journalist, called me and said, would you like to talk? And I was just in the mood to talk. So long story short, I moved to WXIA. I think that was the first major interstation move by an anchorman in the city.
So WXIA was sort of the perennial third place station behind WSB at the top, WAGA, and then What was, as you mentioned, Dick Williams, was that his goal was to juice ratings, and
Sure.
you happened to be the tool.
Well, I think that was the goal, but I think the goal was also to increase the credibility of a station which had been trying everything, and everything they were trying was wrong.
Okay.
And it became clear to them, and I think Dick helped them see this, that to do a newscast in this town, you have to emulate WSB. You have to be solid, and it's going to take some time, but you just have to put forth a credible product. And so Dick and the management at XIA set out to do that, and I think they did a wonderful job. Dave Michaels was my co-anchor. He had been there, but Dave was a very solid guy. We had Art Ekman came in from San Francisco as our sportscaster. We had Russ Minshew as our news, weatherman. So it was a solid team, and the results were immediate. We actually had ratings increases. And we were aided and abetted by the fact that in 1980, NBC and ABC switched stations. So Channel 11, which had been ABC, became NBC, and Channel 2 became ABC. That was in 1980, and that shook the market up a bit. And NBC, even I get confused. That was the beginning of NBC's incredible run with their primetime programming, so that helped Channel 11 a great deal. So it turned out to be a fortunate move for 11. And we did actually come up in the ratings significantly. And we had some good years. We also had some not so great years.
Sure.
Initially, it was very good.
Well, I think you touched on this about moving intra-city rather, that most anchors to move up in the industry to make more money, to get bigger ratings, move from city to city, market to market. Were you ever tempted to make a jump from Atlanta to a larger market, a New York, an LA, a Chicago?
Not really. I did at some point in my career yearn for a network correspondence job, and actually sought that position. And I think I was a finalist for NBC's Southeastern Quadrant. I didn't get the job. It turns out that's probably the best thing that ever happened to me, because I got to stay in Atlanta. It was a city I knew. The viewers knew me, and my career only got better from that point on. If I had been a correspondent, I would have been living out of a suitcase and having a very difficult time keeping a family intact. It's a tough job.
Well, I mean, speaking of suitcases, you did do a number of international reporting stints, Lebanon, China. What took John Pruitt, the anchor of the WXIA Evening News, to Beirut, Lebanon in '83?
Well, the Marine barracks in Beirut was bombed by a terrorist with a truck full of explosives. More than 200 Marines were killed. Awful. And our general manager said, I want you to go. I want you to go to Beirut with a crew, cover the story, and then we want you to go to Israel and do live reports Thanksgiving week for our 6 o'clock news. So that's what we did. Flew to Beirut, wore the flak vest the whole time, got some great stuff. And this was also when President Reagan, you may recall, invaded Grenada to rescue the medical students and sent those troops directly to Beirut. So we were there when they arrived, and you look for the local guys, and there were a lot of local guys, not only in those troops, but also among some of the Marines and the officers who were there. So we localized the story, but that was a huge 2 weeks. I mean, to go live from the King Solomon Sheraton Hotel Thanksgiving week, I mean, I don't recommend Thanksgiving dinner in Israel because it was like nothing I'd ever tasted on Thanksgiving before, but it was quite an experience.
Now, what about your trip to China? This would have been right around the time Deng Xiaoping had sort of emerged as the paramount leader.
1983.
Right.
It was a Friendship Force trip.
Explain that. What was the
Friendship Force? Was a concept. Actually, Jimmy Carter inaugurated the Friendship Force. A minister named Wayne Smith, who was also a close personal friend of mine, was the instigator of the concept. The concept being, if you send ordinary people abroad and live in the homes of those people, do what they do, eat what they eat, share the experience. At the same time, a delegation from that country would come to Atlanta or wherever and have the same experience. Then you're getting to know people, friend to friend, and if we do that on a large enough scale, we don't have to worry about war anymore. It's a wonderful concept, and I think it's workable. I mean, obviously it's worked. It's still going on. But this was in the early initial stages. The first Friendship Force exchange was to Recife, Brazil. I was on that and covered that. China came later. We weren't living in the homes of the Chinese, but we were certainly getting to know them and seeing what their culture was like. And there were other trips to the Netherlands, for example. And it became a worldwide deal, highly successful and a great concept. So we enjoyed covering it, and it did give us a chance to go to China very early in the process of China reemerging on the international scene.
So when you would do these trips, would it be from China you would be doing the news broadcast, or would you have handed it off to somebody who was minding the store in Atlanta.
Yeah, I was gone for 2 weeks, and then
Okay.
we brought everything back in terms of China
Yeah.
to package a documentary on the trip.
Mm-hmm.
In Beirut, it was live from
Oh, wow.
Jerusalem on what we had covered in Beirut.
Okay. Okay. So in 1988, there's the Democratic National Convention. What was it like to not have to? You could stay in your own home and cover that convention.
Yeah, you know, true, but I didn't spend a lot of time in my home. There was so much going on. But it was wonderful. It was a very heady experience in the old Omni.
Oh, wow.
We had our own booth, just like NBC, CBS, and ABC, and covered it, you know, wall to wall. It was incredible. And Ann Richards, poor George, he was born with a silver foot in his mouth.
That's right.
Jesse Jackson, I mean, and of course the nominee Michael Dukakis.
And the president that never was, Sam Nunn.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of people wish he had made that run.
Mm-hmm. So there is some talk that the Democratic National Convention will be back in Atlanta, if not 2024, then pretty soon after.
Oh, it makes sense.
That makes perfect sense,
yeah.
right?
I mean, a state, purple state wannabe. I mean, what better time for the Democrats to come to town?
That's right. And every plane flies here. So
that's right. Transportation, not a problem.
So in 1993, as we talked about 1980s, where WXIA really shot up into the ratings. Doing my research, it looked like in 1990 or so, the ratings start to wobble, and WXIA resumes its sort of third place position. What's your take on, and this is obviously John Pruitt's perspective, on what happened to WXIA in those final years that you were there?
Well, we had a good team, and actually the '88 convention was probably the high watermark of that team and that coverage, because shortly after that, the parent company, Gannett, mandated that we carry USA Today, the TV show. USA Today was, of course, the national newspaper, Gannett publication, and they wanted to do a TV version of that. And we had no place to put the show. So they took an hour-long newscast and cut it to half an hour to put in USA Today. And I warned them. I said, if you do that, the message to the viewers is, you know, we're not credible. You're taking our hour and cutting it in half. I think that was the beginning of a downward trend. And then as ratings slipped, as managements will sometimes do, they began to take steps that, well, in my view, were counterproductive. And in terms of the ratings, obviously counterproductive. So it was within that context that I got a call from WSB, and I was more than happy to enter that conversation.
Now, who would have been your point of contact with WSB? So this would have been 93, 94? Mm-hmm.
It was Greg Stone, the general manager at WSB. Greg called me, and we got together, and we worked out a deal. Mm-hmm. And then I had to, you know, resign from Channel 11, and I had the 6-month non-compete where I was missing in action, or missing in inaction probably would be the better way to put it. It's a complicated story that would probably bore most people, but I viewed, as much as I love Channel 11 and the people there and respect the professionals there, then and now, sometimes an anchor can be in a position of having to do things that he might not want to do, but in this case, I did feel it was in my best interest, career-wise and in every other respect, to leave Channel 11 and go to Channel 2. And it worked out wonderfully, wonderfully.
What was it like to team back up with Monica Kaufman at WSB?
It was as though we had never been apart.
And you had been together for 2-3 years?
Yeah, Monica came in 1975,
okay, yeah.
and I left in '78, so 3 years basically.
And she was really a path breaker in terms of
yes.
female anchor, African-American anchor, a historic figure. I don't use that term lightly. I think she is a historic
No, I
figure.
think you're correct. And, WSB felt strongly that what people saw in the air on our newscast had to reflect the community. It was very obvious we needed African-American anchors, the first of which was actually Jocelyn Dorsey, who came in and anchored the noon news, and I think did some weekend news anchoring. And Monica came in '75, and she was the first 6 and 11 African-American female anchor. And yes, she made history, and I've always given her enormous credit for the role she played in doing that, because she faced a lot of criticism and a lot of nasty phone calls and all of that, and she had the courage to withstand it. And she's always given me too much credit for saying you were behind me and backed me and defended me, and I did, of course, because I knew that her success would be our success, and we all pull for her. It's hard not to. Monica's just a wonderful person. But I will say that in those difficult times when a number of viewers just didn't want that kind of change, she fixed it by being who she was, which was a magnetic, charming, intelligent, engaging presence, credible, who was very human on the air. And I think she just cut across so many stereotypes and actually won the viewers over. And I've told her this, I've told audiences this, I think she probably did more for improved civil rights, improved racial relations, I should say, racial relations in Atlanta than any civil rights leader could have done, because she was there night after night after night, just being herself and, engaging people and winning them over.
I think when I think of Monica Kaufman, I think of her reporting during the Atlanta child murders and that terrible saga of violence and crime and uncertainty, and that famous line, "Do you know where your children are?"
Right.
And I think it meant a lot to people that you had an African-American woman asking these questions and doing this reporting.
Absolutely.
On a crime that struck at the heart of the black community.
Absolutely. Freaknik, too. She also did some great reporting on Freaknik. I think at that time I was actually at WXIA TV watching her do these things and saying, boy, you go, Monica.
I mean, this is an aside, but I think about especially with the proliferation of true crime podcasts and television shows and just the explosion of the genre. What was it like to cover? Thankfully, due to technology and advances in policing and whatnot, we don't seem to have we have a wanton gun violence, but we don't seem to have the serial killers and spree killers that populated the 1970s and into the 1980s. What was it like covering just an awful story like that night after night? Did that wear on you personally?
It was very wearing. It was very wearing because you just didn't know when the next shoe was going to drop, when the next body would be found. And as a backdrop to that, you were quite aware of a city becoming increasingly tense, almost a powder keg. And Mayor Jackson was quite aware of that. You may recall there was a boiler explosion at, I think, one of the housing projects, and everybody immediately thought it was somehow related to this killer who was out there trying to, kill black people in their housing projects. It was no relation, of course.
Right.
But that was what we were dealing with. And so it put a lot on us as reporters to try to keep everything in perspective. But it was a very difficult time, including through the trial of Wayne Williams.
Right.
And there are questions still today about what really happened.
Right. So another sort of high watermark, I suppose, in your career would have been at WSB. That was itself tainted by violence was the 1996 Olympics. Atlanta had prepared for so long, at least since 1989, 1990, for these games, and there's this. And again, we're getting into my lifetime where I remember these things. I remember waking up on the couch in my parents' house, all these crowds, and CNN was on.
Yeah.
What was that like trying as somebody who lived and worked and loved Atlanta? What was that like covering that and the fallout from the media coverage and Richard Jewell and finally?
Well, you're correct in pointing out that this is our town, and as reporters, you want to be as objective and professional as you can be, but by the same token, this was our event, this was our city, and we were here for the world, and it was going so well, and then this happened. And it does have an impact on you, but as anchors, we had to rise above it. You have to understand, this is the middle of the night. Monica and I, rushed back to the station, immediately began anchoring, and I think we anchored all night long, 6 or 7 hours. And yes, I mean, it was almost crushing. And I remember having to summon everything I had to try to be professional, because the temptation was to just let it go,
right?
Because it was so horrible. But I guess our training and our professional instincts kept it that way, and that's the way it should always be. I think a certain amount of empathy at times is called for. Sensitivity is called for, and you can express that. But there are other times when the viewers are depending on you to be solid, sturdy, accurate, and to keep things in perspective, and that was one of those times, because hysteria wasn't that far away for a lot of people. This was a huge event. But on the other side of that, the recovery was magnificent. Andy Young's speech at Central City Park, which the next day, which brought everything back to norm almost. I mean, and it was like Andy saying, it's going to be okay, we love this park, we're going to continue the games. So the way that was handled, I think, was magnificent, and the city went along and recovered as best it could. But I guess we all knew that that episode was going to taint the Atlanta Olympics forever. Sad to say.
What do you say about and this has come back in the last few years especially with the Richard Jewell movie that was, I believe Clint Eastwood directed, about the criticism of the press and their coverage of Richard Jewell and the investigation of Richard Jewell?
Well, obviously, I think the criticism is justifiable, because an innocent man was pilloried and treated as, in fact, a suspect. And it was just quite unfortunate. I think each media outlet will have to answer for how they handle it. I'm happy to tell you that on the afternoon it occurred, I recall distinctly, the AJC came out with the Journal, actually, the afternoon headline.
Right.
Suspect named, or FBI has a suspect. I can't recall the exact headline. We were doing breaking coverage of that, using the newspaper story, attributing to the newspaper story, because we had nothing to pin that on. And I remember throwing to Mark Winnie, our exemplary investigative reporter, who has really good contacts, as you know, and he said I would be very careful about labeling Richard Jewell as a suspect. I think that saved us a lot of lawsuits.
I think that's safe to say.
Not everyone was so fortunate.
Right.
But yeah, I think it's criticism that is justified, and it's caused a lot of soul searching, particularly with our friends at the AJC. Second guessing is easy, and I'm not going to do it. But I think it's always good to examine how you handle these things and be prepared for the next one.
What was it like? What was your decision-making process as your career continued at WSB that led you to say, I'm going to hang it up July 2010?
Well, when you work in television news and you're an anchor person, it's important for you to be there at all times. Your vacations have to be cleared. I have to clear my vacations with my co-anchors. You get the calls in the middle of the night. They need you. Come on in. It's a very restricting job. It's a great job. I love my job, but it was restricting. And as my family began to expand, grandchildren came on the scene. My wife wanted to, take more trips and do more fun things, which I totally understand. I felt that at age 68 would be the appropriate time to go gentle into this good night, shall we say. We had some great younger people there who were eager to step onto the anchor desk, and I was more than happy to let that happen. And it happened gradually. I was doing the 5, the 6, and 11 o'clock news. That's a lot.
That's a lot.
And also doing a lot of specials, which I truly enjoyed. But I gave them up one at a time. The 5 first, and then the 11 to Justin Farmer, and then final night on the 6, and it was done. So it was all very planned and very, very smooth, and I felt it went very well. And I've been very happy in retirement, I might add.
Now, of course, with the last few years, with Georgia being in the headlines, sometimes constantly, especially in terms of politics, do you ever get the urge to hop on a plane or wish that you were down at the Intercontinental Buckhead or Marriott Marquis covering these election night parties?
No, it took me a while, though. It took me a while. Initially, I think the week after I officially retired, we had a big snowstorm.
Oh, yes. I remember it well.
For the first time in my career, instead of going to work, I could actually play with my grandchildren in the snow.
The snowpocalypse.
that was it. But there have been times when politically there have been some stories I would like to weigh in on. And I was lucky in that I did some political commentary for 6 years, even longer. And I still do it on occasion when they call. And I'm happy to do that. But no, I can honestly tell you when I retired, I could walk away from it and not feel any pull to go back.
How do you think, and this is sort of a meta-level question, but how do you think TV news reporting had changed in your decades in the business from your first time covering it in 1964 through 2010 when you
Well, it's changed
signed
enormously. It changed enormously. I mean, back in the 60s, the coverage was, I guess you would say, dull. I mean, it's very pedestrian. All the anchors wanted to be like David Brinkley and Chet Huntley. No room for expression of anything other than just the facts. We were very unanimated on the air. And, of course, the evolution has been anchors, are now quite animated, sometimes even opinionated. And that's been part of the process that was introduced by consultants. I mean, it's an interesting evolution. In the 60s, television news really was viewed as a public service provided by the stations. The FCC required stations to do a certain amount of public service to get their licenses,
right,
keep their licenses. But sponsors, those who bought commercial time, discovered that their spots produced more results when they were in a newscast because the credibility of the newscast reflected on the
right,
sponsors. Long story short, in not a lot of time, TV newscasts became the economic engines of every television station in the country. And when that happened, of course, you have consultants coming in to say, well, let's see what we can do to make it even more profitable.
Okay, so that's a good transition or segue into asking this question about the action news, the 11 Alive model.
Yeah.
When I think of local news, and I think this is the view of a lot of people. I mean, I won't say most people, but the phrase "if it bleeds, it leads," the sort of almost sensationalism tag that's applied to local news. Is that something that, one, do you think that's fair? And two, do you think that's something that came out of this evolutionary model that you're discussing?
Possibly that's partially responsible for it. I think I've always felt that there was far too much crime in a television newscast. That was my mantra for so many years. I never got anywhere with it. And the reason is relatively simple. you've got X number of hours to fill every day. You've got to fill it with material. And what is readily abundant, visual, exciting, if you want to call it that, shocking, it's crime. And it's everywhere, unfortunately, in Atlanta. And so you're always going to have it. It's always going to be, hopefully not sensationalistic, but there's certainly a lot of it. Sensationalism, I don't see a lot of that. I think there's certainly some hype about coverage and that sort of thing. But I think in Atlanta, the coverage is relatively responsible and in perspective. I'm sure I would get arguments on that. But the crime is always going to be with us. And I've always said, if we're going to cover crime, let's do it, put it in perspective. Let's find ways to, amplify the story. And I think that does go on as well. But you just can't get beyond the fact that there's so much crime on TV. Mm-hmm. And that's because it's abundant, it's happening, and it is news. The problem comes when it becomes 75% of the news. I don't think we're there yet, and it's certainly a problem that has to be addressed. So, but I have no real answers for the issue.
By 2010, when you retired, we were into the Obama era. The Tea Party movement was sort of in its inchoate stages, and the criticism of the media by politicians was always there, as you
Sure.
you said, but it wasn't necessarily to the degree, again, as you mentioned, that it is now, to the point where you had a former president call the media the enemy of the people. Fake news and other sort of epithets that were thrown out, but not just by the former president, but by others. Mm-hmm. How do you think that has affected news coverage, especially political news coverage?
That's a really good question. I think some of the criticism of media over the years, in recent years, has probably resulted in a more balanced product. There was a time when if it happened in New York, it was big news, or D.C. or L.A., and I think
Sure.
over the years there's been more of an effort to bring the heartland more into play. The critics of news are always going to be there no matter what we do. It goes with the territory. I'm almost of the school, if you're not being criticized, you're not doing the job well enough. But it does disturb me when I hear things like, we're the enemy of the people. And I've always felt like the public has difficulty really grasping the importance of media. If they could go to a third world country or a communist state and see the total control of media, I mean, we are blessed in this country to be able to get mad at news for whatever they report. And there's so many sources of news today. You can find virtually whatever you want to find, mm-hmm. Responsible or not. So, I mean, there are plenty of options out there, but it's going to always be with us. I don't think it hurts us to be criticized. I think we need to pay attention to criticism and try to improve what we do. But when we're called enemy of the people, then that generates something that's a little scary. And I worry about that. I think people, yes, criticize us, judge us, even harshly, but understand the role we're supposed to play and appreciate the fact that in this country, you can see what's going on. Mm-hmm. And it may take a while to put everything in perspective, but nothing's being hidden.
Do you worry that for a long time, I think viewers made a distinction between national correspondents, your Tom Brokaw's, Peter Jennings, Dan Rathers, and your local news team. I grew up in the Midwest watching KFVS 12 with Mike Shane and Marianne Maloney, and I can still name the weather team that, if there was a tornado, you wanted
Right.
you wanted Brian Allworth and Bob Reeves on TV. Do you think that this sort of antagonism towards media news media has blurred that line between these folks in New York, these folks in Washington, D.C., and the men and women doing the local news?
I think there is a line there, and I think the fact that we are there every night, local anchors, local reporters, accessible, and even more so now than back in my day, Facebook, Twitter, all of that.
Sure.
There's been a real attempt to engage the public with social media. All of this tends to create more familiarity, and the TV personality is a human being. I don't think you always see that at the national level, although I think the anchors try very hard to be more like human beings and say they did back in the days of Huntley Brinkley or even Cronkite.
Yeah.
So yeah, but there's a difference between local and national, and I think the answer is the fact that we're familiar. They know us. They see us. They see our foibles. They see our personalities. They see us joking around on occasion, depending on the story, or they see our reaction to serious news and they feel like we care. And guess what? We do.
So, to the topic that that brought you here to the University of Georgia, your book. I now know, because of this conversation we've had, that writing has been something that you were always interested in, good at, even. What compelled you to write a novel, not necessarily your memoirs or an autobiography or something like
Actually,
that?
I just happen to have a copy of this.
Oh, imagine that.
Tell it true. I have always wanted to write a novel.
Okay.
Like a lot of people. You hear a lot of people.
They say everybody's got a novel.
Working on the great American novel. And I have had this desire for a long, long time. I had the material from half a century of reporting, and I just buckled down and did it.
Right.
And loved the process, and I'm loving the process of going around talking about the book.
Was it always your intention to tell a story rooted in, steeped in Georgia history, Georgia politics?
Write what you know. And so yes. I'm thinking about a second novel, seeing if I can maybe branch out and do something other than Georgia, but frankly, I'm not sure I can.
There's plenty, the soil is there to be tilled.
There's a lot here. There's
Yeah.
a lot here, and I'm already thinking about a possible novel with Georgia as the backdrop.
Well, tell me, what, without giving away the book, I think students of Georgia history and especially Georgia politics will see the echoes in the story that you're telling, especially in your own career, going back to 1964 and your early experiences. Obviously, Lemuel Penn died not too long after you started.
Second week.
First week was
Right.
the Civil Rights Act. Second week, Lemuel Penn and the murder on Broad River Bridge. What is it you hope that readers will take away from this? Maybe readers from your generation, readers from my generation, readers from future generations will take away from this novel?
When I was an anchor, I did a lot of speaking at middle schools, high schools, and I would talk about civil rights. And I was astounded at how little students, black or white, knew about the age of segregation. It was as though they were completely unaware.
And this is not ancient history.
It's not ancient history. So immediately I thought, this is a story that really needs to be told. So I hope that readers of Tell It True will experience in a reading form what it was like in '64 for African Americans, for those who violently opposed the advancement of African Americans, for the politicians, some of whom wanted to keep things as they were, and others of whom felt that we had to get through this progressively, moderately, progressively, whatever, nonviolently. For the media, who Andy Young in my afterword calls the unsung heroes of the civil rights movement, what they had to go through, not only the troops on the ground covering the stories, but also the managements of TV stations and how they had to approach this. And of course, the overarching view of Atlanta as being helped through the shoals of civil rights by wise and pragmatic businessmen, political leaders, and others who did not want Atlanta to become Birmingham and the violence in the streets that occurred there in '63.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that the readers of the book will see the way it was, the way people tried to correct the situation, the way the thought process among some began to change, began to turn. I try to give it an optimistic ending. There's much to be optimistic about. We have come so far. And that may be the ultimate message of the book. We have come far since '64. The unstated message is we've still got a long way to go.
Well, just to wrap it up, I think that touches on a really important note. The farther removed we get from your generation that lived through, participated in, although maybe not as an activist, but as somebody covering the activism and counter-protest, do you worry that subsequent generations have become complacent and don't really understand what it took to get from, as you say, point A to point B, even though there's still a long way to go, that the understanding and appreciation of what it took to get here is lost somewhat?
I'm very, very much afraid that is the case. I see a lack of interest in history that I think is sad, because we need to know. It's a cliche, but yes, we need to know where we've been in order to see where we're going. And if this book accomplishes nothing else, hopefully those who read it will share in the experience of that history and see that we have come a long way.
Well, John, it has been a privilege and an honor to sit down and spend over an hour talking history and politics and your life and career.
The pleasure's all mine, Ashton. Thank you.
It means a lot. It means a lot to the library and to the University of Georgia to have you here recording your stories, your thoughts, and memories. And on behalf of everybody at the Richard B. Russell Library, thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.